Noon in Redstone, dust chokes the air, and a cowboy's holiday pony gets mocked by a grinning crowd. Jake, unfazed, pats his small horse and says, "Speed ain't about size. It's grit." The sheriff, smelling a chance for glory, sets up a chase down Main Street to teach him a lesson. What happens next flips the town's laughter into stunned silence. Stick around to hear how a little horse stole the show. Hey there, listener. How's your day going, and where are you tuning in from? The saloon doors swung shut, leaving glasses half empty on the bar. Redstone's townsfolk spilled onto Main Street, boots kicking up clouds of dry earth. Every man, woman, and kid wanted a front row seat to watch Jake, the quiet cowboy, get schooled by Sheriff Boone and his men. The sun burned high, scorching shoulders through thin shirts, but the crowd's chuckles rang louder than the heat. Boone, leaning against a post, gave a lazy nod to his deputies, who swung into their saddles with practiced ease. Jake stood by his pony, a wiry little beast named Clover, barely taller than a barrel. The townsfolk had been ribbing him for weeks about that horse. Too small, too scrappy, no match for the sheriff's towering stallions. Now they figured Boone would put the drifter in his place. A woman in a faded bonnet whispered to her husband, betting Jake wouldn't last a minute. Her husband snorted, spitting tobacco into the dirt, and said he gave it 30 seconds. The street buzzed with anticipation, like the hum before a storm. Kids climbed onto barrels for a better view, while shopkeepers leaned out of doorways, wiping sweaty hands on aprons. Boone's deputies, 3 men with weathered faces and heavy revolvers, lined up their horses, each animal snorting and pawing the ground. Jake didn't look at them. He just adjusted his hat, squinting into the glare, his face calm as a still pond. The crowd's laughter grew sharper, fueled by the promise of a spectacle. They didn't care much for Jake, a loner who'd rolled into town a month ago, keeping to himself, but they loved a good show, and Boone was happy to deliver. He raised a hand, silencing the chatter, and the street went quiet, save for the creak of leather saddles and the faint jingle of spurs. The crowd's jeers sharpened as a wiry trader, his apron stained with flour, leaned over a crate and hollered, "Tie a ribbon on that pony, Jake. Make it festive." Laughter erupted, rippling through the onlookers like wind over wheat. A few kids giggled, pointing at Clover, whose ears flicked as if she understood the slight. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't bite back. His eyes, hard as flint, locked on the trader for a moment before sliding to Sheriff Boone, who stood smirking by the saloon's hitching post. Boone's grin was all teeth, the kind of smile that thrived on attention. He saw his moment. Humiliating a drifter like Jake would cement his reputation in Redstone for another year. He pushed off the post, dusting his hands, and sauntered toward his horse, a broad-chested bay that dwarfed Clover. "Let's see if that runt can keep up," he called, loud enough for the crowd to hear. The townsfolk roared, clapping and whistling, egging him on. Jake didn't respond. He ran a hand along Clover's flank, checking the cinch with deliberate care. The pony stood steady, unbothered by the noise, her small frame taut with quiet defiance. A few in the crowd noticed Jake's silence, and their laughs faltered, replaced by curious glances. Boone swung into his saddle, his deputies falling in line behind him, their horses stomping restlessly. The sheriff's voice cut through the chatter. "You ready to eat dust, Drifter?" Jake finally looked up, his gaze steady, not a trace of anger. "Reckon we'll see who's eating what," he said, his voice low but clear, carrying just enough edge to make the front row shift uncomfortably. The crowd hushed for a split second, sensing the shift, like a card game where the stakes just doubled. Boone's smirk flickered, but he waved it off, turning to his men with a nod. The challenge was set, and Redstone held its breath. Jake knelt beside Clover, his fingers tracing the worn leather of the saddle strap. He tugged it tight, feeling the pony's steady breath under his hand. Clover snorted, her small hooves scuffing the dirt, as if she sensed the game was about to start. The crowd's chatter dulled to a murmur, their eyes darting between Jake's calm routine and the sheriff's men, who adjusted their reins with impatient jerks. Dust hung thick in the air, sticking to sweaty brows under the relentless noon sun. Sheriff Boone sat tall in his saddle, his bay horse tossing its head, eager to move. He spat a wad of tobacco onto the ground, the dark stain spreading in the dirt like a warning. His deputies, grim-faced and squinting, flanked him, their heavy horses shifting under the weight of men and gear. Boone raised his hand, fingers splayed, and the crowd stilled, the silence so sharp it felt like the crack of a whip. "Let's make this quick," he said, his voice carrying a smug edge. Jake stood, brushing dust from his knees, and gave Clover a gentle pat on the neck. The pony's ears flicked forward, alert. Her small frame coiled like a spring. He swung into the saddle with a fluid motion, settling in as if he and Clover were one. A few townsfolk exchanged glances. His ease didn't match their expectations of a man about to be humiliated. A woman in a faded shawl whispered to her neighbor, "He ain't even sweating." Boone's eyes narrowed, catching the shift in the crowd's mood. He leaned forward, his spurs glinting as they brushed his horse's flanks. "Last chance to back out, Drifter," he called, loud enough for the back row to hear. Jake didn't flinch. He tipped his hat slightly, his voice steady as stone. "Ain't here to talk, Sheriff. Let's ride." The words landed like a gauntlet, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. The air grew heavy, charged with the weight of what was coming. A shopkeeper leaned against his doorframe, wiping his hands on a rag, while kids perched on barrels held their breath. Clover pawed the ground, ready. Boone's hand dropped, the signal hanging in the air like the echo of a gunshot. Every eye on Main Street locked on the riders, waiting for the dust to fly. Boone's hand sliced through the air, and the street exploded into motion. Clover shot right, her small hooves digging into the dirt, kicking up a spray of dust that stung the eyes of the front-row gawkers. Boone's men charged straight, their heavy horses thundering forward, shaking the ground like a stampede. The crowd roared, their shouts blending into a chaotic hum, betting on a quick end to Jake's defiance. But Jake sat steady in the saddle, his body upright, not even leaning into the wind. Clover weaved through the edge of Main Street, her movements sharp and deliberate like a fox dodging hounds. The sheriff's bay led the charge, its long strides eating up ground, while the deputies' horses fanned out, trying to box Jake in. A man in a tattered vest yelled, "He's done for!" as Boone's horse surged closer, its shadow looming over Clover's flank. The crowd's cheers spiked, fueled by the sight of raw power bearing down on the little pony. Jake's eyes flicked to the side, reading the street's layout. Barrels, a water trough, a narrow gap by the blacksmith's shop. He nudged Clover with a subtle shift of his knee, and she darted toward the gap, her small frame slipping through where the bigger horses couldn't follow. The crowd's noise faltered for a heartbeat, some squinting to track the pony's path. A kid on a crate pointed, shouting, "He's cutting through!" Boone cursed under his breath, yanking his reins to follow, but his bay skidded, kicking up a cloud of grit. The deputies fumbled, their horses bumping shoulders as they tried to mimic Jake's turn. One man's hat flew off, landing in the dirt to a burst of laughter from a few onlookers. Jake didn't look back. His hands stayed light on the reins, letting Clover find her rhythm, her hooves clipping the ground in a steady, unhurried beat. The street stretched ahead, lined with weathered storefronts and curious faces. Clover's path hugged the edges, using every inch of space to her advantage. Boone's men pushed harder, their horses snorting with effort, but the gap wasn't closing as fast as they'd hoped. A woman clutched her shawl, muttering, "That pony's got some nerve." The crowd's roar softened, replaced by a murmur of surprise. Jake and Clover weren't just running, they were outsmarting the chase. The chase tore around the first bend, and the crowd's laughter choked on dust. Boone's lead deputy, a burly man named Rawls, leaned hard into his horse, aiming to cut Jake off. His stallion clipped a pharmacy sign, sending it crashing into the dirt with a splintered crack. Gasps replaced cheers as splinters flew, and a woman in a faded dress pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. Clover, unbothered, sliced the corner tight, her hooves carving a clean arc through the chaos. Jake kept his gaze forward, reading the street like a map. Clover's small frame ducked under a low awning, her movements fluid, almost mocking the lumbering horses behind her. The crowd, packed along the boardwalks, started to shift. A shopkeeper, his apron flapping, muttered, "That pony's dancing circles around him." The jeers that had filled the air minutes ago fizzled, replaced by a tense quiet, broken only by the thud of hooves and the creak of strained saddles. Boone's face reddened, his jaw set as he spurred his bay harder. The horse snorted, foam flecking its mouth, but it couldn't match Clover's nimble turns. Another deputy's horse stumbled, kicking up a clod of dirt that hit a bystander's boots. The man cursed, stepping back, and the crowd's mood tilted further. What started as a spectacle was turning into something else, something that made the townsfolk glance at each other unsure. A kid perched on a barrel tugged his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why ain't Jake scared?" She shushed him, but her eyes stayed glued to the chase, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Jake and Clover hit another turn, threading between a wagon and a hitching post with inches to spare. The crowd held its breath, waiting for a stumble that didn't come. Rawls shouted something lost in the dust, his horse veering too wide, scraping a storefront. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a hush that felt heavier than the heat. Townsfolk who'd bet on Boone's victory started looking at their boots, avoiding each other's eyes. Clover's steady rhythm, her small hooves clipping the ground, was louder than the sheriff's men crashing through the street. Jake's calm, his refusal to rush, made the chase feel less like a race and more like a lesson unfolding in the dust. Dust rose like a curtain, cloaking Main Street as Clover darted past a row of barrels. Jake leaned slightly, guiding her with a nudge, his hands steady on the reins. The pony hugged the edge of the boardwalk, her small hooves finding gaps where Boone's horses faltered. The sheriff's bay surged forward, its heavy strides chewing up ground, but each turn cost it momentum. Boone's spurs dug in, his face twisting as Clover slipped through another narrow alley between a saloon and a general store. The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs growing sharp with disbelief. A blacksmith, his arms crossed, nodded slowly, muttering to a neighbor, "That drifter knows his horse." Clover wove through the street's clutter, crates, a stray cart, a water pump, like a needle threading cloth. Boone's deputies tried to follow, but their horses, bred for power, not finesse, clipped obstacles, sending splinters and curses flying. One deputy's stirrup caught a post, jerking him sideways, and a ripple of gasps swept the onlookers. Jake's focus never wavered. His eyes scanned the street, picking paths that turned the town's chaos into his ally. Clover responded instantly, her small frame twisting through tight spaces, her breath steady despite the pace. Boone, now trailing by a horse's length, shouted to his men, "Cut him off at the livery!" His voice cracked with frustration, betraying the calm he'd worn earlier. The crowd caught it, and a few heads turned, sensing the sheriff's control slipping. A woman with a basket of laundry paused, her eyes following Clover's sharp cuts. "He's playing 'em," she whispered to a friend who nodded, clutching her bonnet. The street's dust thickened, stinging eyes and throats, but Jake and Clover moved like they could see through it. The pony's hooves kicked up precise bursts of dirt, while Boone's men left clouds that choked their own path. A kid on a crate clapped, unable to hide his grin, as Clover dodged a rolling barrel dislodged by a deputy's horse. Boone's anger was plain now, his posture rigid, his spurs jabbing harder. His bay snorted, eyes wild, but Clover's nimble dance kept her ahead. The street seemed to shrink, every turn tightening the chase, and the crowd's silence deepened, broken only by the rhythm of hooves. Jake wasn't just running, he was outmaneuvering the sheriff in front of the whole town, and Redstone was starting to notice. A shout broke the dust-choked silence as Clover rounded a corner by the barber's shop. "He's making fools of 'em," hollered a grizzled prospector, his pipe nearly falling from his mouth. The crowd stirred, their eyes tracking Jake and his pony, who moved like a shadow slipping through sunlight. Clover cut past a stack of crates, her hooves barely touching the dirt, while Boone's men barreled through, knocking over a water bucket that splashed the front row. The crowd's laughter, once aimed at Jake, now turned on the deputy's clumsy charge. Boone's face darkened, his jaw clenched tight as he spurred his bay forward. His horse, lathered with sweat, snorted in protest, its heavy frame struggling to match Clover's sharp turns. The deputies fanned out, trying to trap Jake, but their horses collided near a hitching post, sending one man cursing as he yanked his reins. A woman in a patched apron chuckled, nudging her neighbor. "Sheriff's boys look like they're herding cats, not a pony." Jake rode steady, his posture calm, almost leisurely, as if the chase was just another day's work. Clover weaved through a narrow gap by the feed store, her small size letting her slip where the bigger horses couldn't. The crowd's mood shifted, their jeers fading into murmurs of admiration. A kid on a barrel waved his hat, shouting, "Go, little horse!" His mother didn't hush him this time. She was too busy watching, her hands twisting her scarf. The townsfolk, who'd gathered to see Jake humbled, now leaned forward, caught by the unexpected skill of the drifter and his pony. A shopkeeper, wiping sweat from his brow, muttered to his wife, "Didn't think that runt had it in her." The street's dust swirled, but Clover's path stayed clear, her movements precise, like a dancer hitting every step. Boone's men, red-faced and panting, looked less like hunters and more like men chasing a ghost. The laughter that lingered wasn't cruel anymore. It carried a grudging respect. A few men nodded, their arms crossed as Clover dodged another obstacle, leaving Boone's deputy to skid into a pile of empty crates. The crash drew a fresh wave of chuckles, and the crowd's allegiance tipped. Redstone loved a winner, and Jake, without saying a word, was rewriting the story they'd come to see. Boone's eyes widened as Clover slipped through a gap by the livery stable. The realization hit him like a slug of bad whiskey. Jake wasn't just lucky, he was outsmarting them. The sheriff's bay snorted, its flanks slick with sweat, as he yanked the reins to force a sharper turn. His deputies, struggling to keep up, fanned out clumsily, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that blurred the street. Jake, meanwhile, rode with a quiet precision, his body swaying just enough to guide Clover through another tight weave past a parked wagon. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a few clapping as Clover dodged a low beam with inches to spare. Boone's jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the reins. He'd planned to make Jake a laughingstock, but the drifter's calm control was turning the chase into a public lesson. "Head him off at the church!" Boone barked, his voice hoarse, betraying a crack of doubt. His men spurred their horses, but one deputy's mount shied at a stray dog, nearly unseating him. A ripple of laughter spread through the onlookers. Jake didn't glance back. His eyes stayed fixed on the street's twists, reading every obstacle like a book he'd memorized. Clover's small hooves clipped the dirt in a steady rhythm. Her ears flicked forward, alert but unshaken. Boone tried to cut across, aiming to trap Jake in a dead-end alley by the saloon, but Clover pivoted, her small frame spinning in a tight arc, leaving Boone's bay to skid and snort in frustration. The crowd gasped, a woman dropping her basket as she leaned forward to watch. A man in a worn coat muttered to his friend, "Sheriff's chasing his own tail." The words carried, and a few heads nodded, their respect for Boone eroding with every missed chance. The deputies collided again, their horses' shoulders bumping as they tried to block Jake's path. One man swore, his hat knocked askew, and the crowd's chuckles grew bolder. Boone's face burned, his plan unraveling in front of Redstone's eyes. For a moment, his gaze met Jake's across the dusty street. Jake's expression didn't change. No smirk, no triumph. Just a steady look that said he knew exactly what he was doing. Boone's confidence cracked, his shoulders slumping slightly as he realized the chase wasn't his to control. The dust settled briefly, and Clover's hooves echoed alone, a quiet reminder of who was setting the pace. Jake guided Clover past the town's water tower, her hooves kicking up small puffs of dust with each step. He didn't push her to sprint, keeping a steady rhythm that let her weave through the street's clutter. A broken crate, a stray rope, a tilted signpost. Clover moved like she knew every inch of Redstone, her small frame turning the chase into a display of control, not chaos. The crowd, now packed tightly along the boardwalks, watched with wide eyes, their earlier jeers replaced by hushed awe. Boone's horse heaved, its breaths loud and ragged. As the sheriff leaned forward, spurs digging in, he shouted to his deputies, "Box him in, damn it!" But his men were flagging, their heavy horses stumbling over ruts in the dirt. One deputy's mount clipped a barrel, sending it rolling into the street, and a kid scampered out of the way, his mother yanking him back by the collar. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps, their attention locked on Clover's effortless dodges. Jake's face stayed calm, his hands light on the reins, letting Clover choose her path. She cut left, then right, slipping through a narrow gap by the tailor's shop where Boone's bay couldn't follow. A woman in a patched bonnet whispered, "That pony's got more brains than the sheriff." Her friend nodded, clutching a basket as the crowd's loyalty shifted further. This wasn't a race anymore, it was a demonstration, and Jake was proving his point without raising his voice. Boone's frustration boiled over, his shouts growing sharper as he tried to close the gap. His horse, weighed down by its bulk, skidded on a patch of loose dirt, and the crowd flinched, expecting a crash. It didn't come, but the near miss drew a low whistle from a man leaning against a post. "Drifters making this look easy," he muttered, spitting tobacco. Clover, unhurried, kept her pace, her small strides eating up the street while Boone's men floundered behind. The townsfolk saw it now. Jake wasn't running from a fight. He was winning one. His control, his trust in Clover turned the chase into something bigger than a spectacle. A shopkeeper, his apron dusted with flour, shook his head and said, "Ain't about the horse's size, is it?" The crowd's silence agreed, their eyes following Jake as he and Clover moved like they owned the street, proving a point sharper than any bullet. Clover's hooves clipped the dirt as she neared the end of Main Street where the road curved sharply by the old feed store. Jake leaned slightly, guiding her with a nudge, his eyes scanning the path ahead, a tangle of wagons and crates blocking the way. Clover didn't hesitate, darting through a narrow gap between a cart and a stack of barrels, her small frame slicing the turn like a knife. The crowd gasped, some stepping back as dust swirled, obscuring the street in a gritty haze. Boone's bay charged forward, its heavy strides shaking the ground, but the turn came too fast. The sheriff yanked the reins, but his horse skidded, hooves sliding in the loose dirt, and barreled past the curve, nearly toppling a merchant's cart. Apples and tin cans spilled across the street, rolling underfoot as the crowd scrambled out of the way. A woman shrieked, pulling her kid behind a post while Boone's deputies fumbled, their horses colliding in the chaos. One man's stirrup snapped, leaving him cursing as he clung to his saddle. Jake didn't look back. Clover hugged the inside of the turn, her movement smooth, almost effortless, as if she'd run this street 100 times. The crowd's murmurs swelled into cheers, a few hats waving in the air. A blacksmith, his arms thick from years at the forge, nudged his neighbor and said, "That drifter's got more sense than all of 'em." The townsfolk who'd come to see Jake humbled now shouted for the pony, their voices carrying a new respect. Boone's face was a storm of sweat and fury, his spurs digging harder as he tried to recover. His horse snorted, eyes rolling, but the gap between him and Clover widened. The deputies, red-faced and panting, couldn't keep up, their heavy mounts tripping over the spilled goods. A kid on a barrel laughed outright, pointing as a deputy's horse kicked a stray apple into the air. The crowd's cheers for Jake grew louder, drowning out Boone's shouted orders. Clover cleared the turn and slowed, her hooves steady as Jake brought her to a stop in the middle of the street. He sat tall, dusting his hat against his thigh, calm as if he'd just ridden to the store for tobacco. The dust settled and the townsfolk stared, their breaths held as Boone's men stumbled to a halt, their horses heaving. Jake's point was made, clear as the noon sun overhead. The dust settled on Main Street, and Redstone went quiet, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap. Jake sat still in the saddle, Clover's sides barely heaving, her small hooves planted firm in the dirt. The crowd stood frozen, their eyes darting from the drifter to Boone, who wiped sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. His bay horse snorted, head low, while his deputies' mounts pawed the ground, their riders slouched and silent. Nobody laughed now, not a chuckle, not a whisper. A shopkeeper in a stained apron coughed, breaking the stillness, but even he looked down, avoiding Boone's glare. The townsfolk, who'd come for a spectacle, stood with tight lips, their earlier bets on the sheriff's victory now a weight in their pockets. A woman in a faded shawl clutched her basket, her knuckles white, as if she'd just seen something she couldn't unsee. Jake's calm, his steady hand patting Clover's neck, spoke louder than any shout. Boone straightened in his saddle, his face a mix of red and pale, like a man caught between rage and shame. He opened his mouth, but no words came, just a sharp breath cut off by the crowd's heavy silence. His deputies shifted uncomfortably, one brushing dirt from his sleeve, another staring at the ground where a broken crate lay scattered. The kid on the barrel who'd cheered for Clover sat still now, his hat clutched in his hands, sensing the moment's weight. Jake's eyes swept the street, not lingering on Boone or his men. He adjusted his hat, the brim casting a shadow over his face, and let out a slow breath. The townsfolk watched, waiting for a taunt, a smirk, anything to break the tension. But Jake just sat there, Clover's ears flicking as if she too knew the show was over. A man in a worn coat muttered to his friend, "Didn't need to say a word, did he?" His friend nodded, spitting tobacco into the dirt. The silence stretched, heavy as the heat, until a distant dog barked, snapping the spell. A few townsfolk shuffled, their boots scuffing the boardwalk, but nobody spoke. Boone's shoulders sagged, his authority stripped bare in front of Redstone. The verdict wasn't spoken, it didn't need to be. Jake and Clover had turned the chase into a lesson, and the town wouldn't forget it anytime soon. Jake slid from Clover's saddle, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He ran a hand along the pony's mane, her small frame steady under his touch, as if the chase was just a morning stroll. The crowd watched, their silence lingering, every eye on the drifter who'd turned their laughter into respect. Boone sat rigid on his bay, his face flushed, one hand gripping the reins like they might snap. His deputies, disheveled and dusty, avoided looking at him or the townsfolk. Jake glanced at Boone, his expression calm, almost curious. "Sheriff," he said, his voice low but clear. "Need a map for them turns?" The words landed soft, like a pebble in a pond, and a ripple of chuckles spread through the crowd. Not mocking, but warm, the kind of laugh that comes with grudging admiration. A woman in a patched bonnet smothered a grin, her husband nudging her with a smirk. The kid on the barrel clapped, his hat back on his head, eyes bright with excitement. Boone's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling too loud in the quiet. He brushed dust from his vest, trying to reclaim some shred of authority, but the townsfolk's gazes stayed on Jake. A shopkeeper leaned against his doorframe, muttering to a neighbor, "Ain't nobody calling that pony a joke now." His friend nodded, spitting into the dirt, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Clover snorted, shaking her head, and Jake gave her a pat, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't gloat, didn't need to. The street itself told the story. Scattered crates, a toppled cart, and Boone's men catching their breath while Clover stood unruffled. The crowd began to disperse, some heading back to the saloon, others lingering to watch Jake lead Clover to a water trough. A few men tipped their hats as he passed, a gesture he returned with a slight nod. Redstone's dust settled and the noon sun burned on, but the town felt different. Boone stalked toward the sheriff's office, his boots heavy, his deputies trailing like scolded dogs. Jake didn't watch them go. He knelt by Clover, checking her hooves, and murmured something only she could hear. The lesson was clear. Size didn't win fights. Grit did. And Redstone wouldn't forget it. The sun dipped low, painting Redstone's dusty street in shades of gold. Jake led Clover to the edge of town, her hooves scuffing the dirt as they passed the last of the weathered storefronts. He hadn't said much since the chase, just tipped his hat to a few lingering townsfolk who nodded back, their eyes carrying a new respect. Word of the day's events was already spreading, whispered in the saloon and muttered over supper tables. Clover, the holiday pony, was no joke anymore. At the hitching post by the livery, Jake tied Clover's reins and filled a bucket with water. She drank steadily, her small frame calm, as if outrunning Boone's men was just another job done right. A grizzled old-timer, leaning on a cane, shuffled over and squinted at Jake. "Knew you had it in you, son," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Ain't the horse, it's the rider." Jake gave a half smile, brushing dust from his sleeve, and murmured, "She did most of the work." Across town, Boone sat in his office, the door slammed shut, his hat tossed on the desk. His deputies slunk in, avoiding his glare, their boots tracking dirt across the floorboards. The sheriff stared out the window, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. He'd wanted a spectacle, a chance to flex his authority, but Jake's quiet victory had left him looking small. A kid passing by the office window mimicked Clover's sharp turn, laughing, and Boone's jaw tightened. Redstone wasn't his stage anymore. Back at the livery, a small crowd gathered, not the jeering mob from noon, but a handful of curious folks, drawn by the story taking shape. A woman with a basket of bread offered Jake a loaf, saying, "For you and that pony." He took it with a nod, his eyes scanning the horizon where the road stretched out of town. Whispers followed him. Some said he'd leave by dawn, others bet he'd stay to rub it in. Jake didn't care for either guess. As twilight settled, Jake mounted Clover, the saddle creaking under his weight. The old-timer watched, leaning on his cane, and called out, "Where you headed, Drifter?" Jake paused, his gaze steady, and said, "Somewhere the dust ain't so thick." The crowd chuckled softly, and Clover snorted, ready to move. Redstone would talk about this day for years, but Jake was already looking down the road where new stories waited.